Hello viewers, welcome to week 8, lecture 4 of SWAYAM course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University, and in this lecture I am going to talk about phenomenology and Wolfgang Iser's contribution to reader response criticism, as well as the concept of narrative or who is reader. We'll be talking about all these issues in this lecture. For example, in the previous lecture, we ended with the discussion of open text and closed text as effected by Umberto Eco in his book The Role of the Reader, in which Eco makes this point that an open text is one which invites the reader in a sort of collaboration for making it complete or for making its complete sense. But so far as the closed text is concerned, it already shows certain codes to the readers by which they are able to determinate the meaning of the text, right? Such as detective fiction. So, Eco also speculates on how codes available to the reader determine what the text means as it is read. Often this question is asked that when we are talking about fiction, often we talk about various kinds of narrators, like omniscient narrator or unreliable narrator or implied author, and all such things are there. But there is never this question asked that who is going to be the addressee of this discourse, right? Whom that author, with all different points of view, is going to address the matter of the text. So, in that way, Gerald Prince's concept of narrative is important, where he says that narrative refers to the addressee of the narrator. It is a fictive entity to which narrator directs his narration. And at the same time, he makes this point that the narrative should not be confused with the reader. The narrative may be, an entity different from the reader. For example, the narrator may specify a narrative in terms of sex. For example, if somebody is being addressed, some character as dear madam, or class, gentleman, or situation as a reader is sitting in his armchair, right? So all these things may give us clue that who may be the narrative of this text. And at the same time, narrative may not be the actual reader. The actual reader may be someone who is a black male or a young minor reading in bed. So, in this way, he says that the narrative is also distinguished from the virtual reader, the sort of reader whom the author has in mind while developing his narrative, and the ideal reader, the perfectly insightful reader who understands the writer's every move. So, if we look at this dimension, as Prince is discussing, we find that even there are many categories of readers as well, or narrative. So, it is not that only in context of author, omniscient author, or first person point of view, or implied author, or such things can be discussed. Even virtual reader, actual reader, in which he says that virtual reader may be someone who is in mind when the narrator is narrating something. Actual reader is a competent reader, who has all the competence to read a text. So there are different kinds of readers, and narrative is something that emphasizes those dimensions of readers or multiplicity of readers. So there are many signals, direct and indirect, which contribute to our knowledge of narrative. For example, when the narrator apologizes for certain inadequacies in the discourse, for instance, I cannot convey this experience in words, this indirectly tells us something of the narrative's susceptibilities and values. So sometimes the narrative is an important character. For instance, in A Thousand and One Nights, the very survival of the narrator Scheherazade, it depends on the continual ac- attention of the narrative, the caliph, right? And if caliph loses interest in his stories, the narrator's life may come to an end and it may be endangered, right? So in this way, we find that how that narrative, the presence of narrative, it could assume multiple perspectives, multiple persona in a text. So the effect of Prince's elaborate theory is to highlight a dimension of narration which has been understood intuitively by readers but which had remained shadowy and undefined. So in this way, we find that how he contributes to reader-oriented theory by drawing attention to the ways in which narratives produce their own readers or listeners who may or may not coincide with the actual reader, right? Having said that, now let us try to understand phenomenology in detail, which was very influential in giving shape to reader response theory. So, phenomenology is a modern philosophical tendency which stresses the perceiver's central role in determining meaning. For example, we referred to Husserl in the previous lecture, where Husserl says that the proper object of philosophical investigation is not the object itself, right? It is the content of our consciousness. And this consciousness of ours, it decides what is the nature of the object. For example, in this way, he is very close to the romantic theorist. And if we look at all the ages of literature, or if we look at literary history, we find that how during the romantic age, the role of reader was important, but it was only for a short while. Soon after that, we find that multiple objective theories were propounded by critics like Arnold or T.S. Eliot and Richards later on, and how this role of reader or the role of subjective consciousness was eclipsed. The most remarkable example is that of Coleridge's line that in terms of nature, where he says, "O lady, we receive but what we give. In our life alone doth nature live. Ours is her shroud, ours is her wedding garment." So there we find that how Coleridge is trying to make this point, that what is the nature of the world that we see around. It all depends on our consciousness. If we are cheerful, then the entire nature looks like an adorned bride. And if we are sad, the entire nature depends to be clouded by shroud. So this is what we say, and it can also be understood in terms of Greek word phenomena, which means things appearing, as they appear to human consciousness. And Husserl was primarily working along these lines. However, phenomenology claims to show us the underlying nature of both human consciousness and phenomena, as we find that how Heidegger gives it a different direction, and that we will try to understand. So, in literary theory, this approach did not encourage a purely subjective concern for the critic's mental structure. Rather, it promoted a type of criticism which tries into the world of a writer's work and to arrive at an understanding of the underlying nature or essence of writings as they appear to the critic's consciousness. So here we find that how in reader response criticism, both dimensions have been balanced. For example, a reader response critic, he explores the psyche of the author, and at the same time, he pays attention to the understanding of the critics or the readers. So text and uh, reader both are kept at par. There is a free play between them, as we can say. For example, the early works of J. Hillis Miller, uh, a deconstructionist, were influenced by the phenomenological theories of the Geneva School of Critics, which included George Poulet and Jean Starobinsky. We find that when Hillis Miller studies Hardy's novels, he finds that how Hardy's novel uncovers the pervasive mental structures, namely distance and desire. So Hillis says that in this act of interpretation, Hillis is able to uh, have access to the mind of the reader, to the mind of the author. The workings of the author's mind are known to the critic. And in this way, a critic is able to make sense of the text. Right? For example, he says, the act of interpretation is possible because the text allows the reader access to author's consciousness, allows me, author's consciousness, which Poulet says is open to me, welcomes me, lets me look deep inside itself, and allows me to think what it thinks and feel what it feels. However, we can say that this kind of reading practice, it will be decried by Derrida, and Derrida will call it a sort of logocentric approach in which, meaning is at one time centered in the subject, that is the author's mind, and then it is recentered to the object, that is the reader's mind. However, these uh, reader response theorists believe that there should be an interplay of the two, no privileging of one over the other, or it should not be that we should ascertain one center and then shift it to the other center. So the centering should not be done. The shift towards a reader-oriented theory is prefigured in the rejection of Husserl's objective view by his follower Martin Heidegger. Heidegger argues that what is distinctive about human existence is its givenness. That is what he calls Dasein. But he says that our consciousness not only projects the things of the world, at the same time it is also subjected to the world by the very nature of existence in the world. He says that we find ourselves flung down into the world, into a time and place we did not choose. But at the same time, it is our world insofar as our consciousness projects it. We can never adopt an attitude of detached contemplation. We are merged with the very object of our consciousness. So here we find that how Heidegger is talking about the blending of the subject, that is consciousness, and the object, what is perceived by the mind. He says that we cannot make a sense of reality by elevating ourselves at the top of a mountain, as if detaching ourselves from the object itself and then observing it from a detached distance. He says that it is always inter-animating principle in which the object affects our consciousness. That is what he calls thinking in a situation, right? So this situatedness, and situatedness is always in historical and social context. However, he says that historical and social may be external, but it merges with internal and inward in the process of thinking, right? And in this way, this situational approach, that is what Gadamer has used in his truth end method. So, Gadamer says that this Heidegger's situational approach neatly parceled bundle of meaning, and meaning depends on historical situation of the interpreter. Further, Wolfgang Iser was influenced by Hans Georg Gadamer, and Easer says that the task of a critic is not to explain the text, not to make sense of the text, rather, the act of a critic, the task of a critic, or the function of criticism is to talk about the effect that a text has on the mind of the reader and in what ways a reader makes sense of that text. For example, in that way, Easer makes a distinction between implied reader and actual reader. You know, an implied reader is one who is created by the text, and he tries to read the text according to the given conventions, and many times there is a network of response and inviting structures which predispose us to read it in certain ways. So an implied reader is one who is making a sense of the text with the help of the given conventions or codes which the text is able to frame for the reader. But so far as an actual reader is concerned, an actual reader, brings his own experience, and he is not dependent on the conventions and codes which are generated by text in the practice of reading. Right. For example, if we are atheist, we will be affected differently by a poem of Wordsworth than if we were Christian. So, for example, we can understand the role of this distinction between an implied reader and actual reader. An actual reader is one whose understanding of Wordsworth will depend on what are his moral and ethical values in terms of theology. So an actual reader is one who fills in the blanks and gaps which can be found in the text. We can take another example. For example, A Farewell to Arms, a novel by Ernest Hemingway. So we find that in that novel how conventional words such as honor and glory, they may be elaborated or fabricated for understanding that novel. However, an actual reader is one who brings in his own notion of honor and glory, which are very different from the general notions of honor and glory, which are often associated with the concept of war. And in this way, he will be able to fill in many blanks and gaps in a text with the help of those experiences of his own. That is what Easer calls actual reader, right? So, for example, if we further take the practice of Easer that he has applied to that novel by Henry Fielding, Tom Jones, where we can find that how two characters, that Allworthy is represented as a perfect man and Captain Blifil is a hypocrite. So, the reader's imaginary object, that is the perfect man, is subject to true modification. When Allworthy is taken in by Blifil, we adjust the imaginary object in view of the perfect man's lack of judgment. For example, in Tom Jones, the author may have, established the image of Allworthy as a perfect man. But when the reader reads, the novel, and he finds that how many times Allworthy, appears to be a gullible guy, the way he is trapped by Captain Blifil. So, in this way, our, understanding of what is called the perfect man is challenged. And in this way, the reader makes his own sense of perfection, and it is in conflict with what the author has tried to establish. So, in this way, all these things are there when we talk about the act of reading. And in this way, Easer tries to assert that our reading, a reader's reading of the text, it can be taken as a journey where, many times his understanding of these notions such as someone is perfect, someone is hypocrite, they are confounded by, they find what is happening with the characters or the way they find characters behaving in a certain way. So in this way we find that what we grasp as we read is only a series of changing viewpoints, not something fixed and fully meaningful at every point. So, a literary work does not represent objects, but it does refer to the extra literary world by selecting certain norms, value systems, or worldviews. So here Ezer is talking about worldviews. One thing, worldviews can be understood in two ways. One, what the novel has tried to establish. What are the values that the novelist tried to propound through various characters, and what a reader has his own worldview. And every reader's worldview is subject to change in context of his historical location, in context of his geographical location, in context of his psychology. And in this way, we find that a text is always in a dialogue, right? So dynamics are always there, which keep changing the interpretation of a text depending on the geography, history, psychology of the author. Yeah, and in this way, even in that way, we can understand that how a text meaning can never be singular. See, try to understand that what we read in uh, post-structuralism or deconstruction, this multiplicity of meaning, this plurality of meaning, all these things were there. But it was solely understood in the concept of language. The nature of language was always emphasized here. But here, the role of reader is there. Of course, a reader will make sense of any text through language, but reader response criticism slightly goes beyond that. Language is there, of course, because only through that a reader will make sense of it. But his own situatedness in his historical geographical location or situation, it will also add a new dimension to it. So there we find that these norms are concepts of reality which help human beings to make sense of chaos of their experience. In this way, the text adopts a repertoire of values, systems, and worldviews and suspend their validity within its fictional world. For example, if we look at Tom Jones, we find that there are different characters, and all these characters are having different traits. For example, Allworthy, benevolence; Square, Western, ruling passion; Square, the eternal fitness of things; and Sophia, the ideality of natural inclination. So here we find that the reader is impelled by the unfinished nature of the text to relate the values of hero to various norms that are violated by the hero in specific incidents. For example, if we look at the character of Tom, it is not that we make sense of Tom as the novel has tried to establish him through various intrinsic conditions. We also find a kind of immaturity in Tom, and many times he commits many mistakes, right? So in this way, we can also question his status of being a hero. So that is how this moral judgment on Tom cannot be given by the intrinsic laws of the text. It can be given only by the readers. And in a novel, we find that these value systems at random. So as readers, we need to insert many things into the interpretation in order to fill a gap in the text. Even though there are gaps in the text to be filled, the text is definitely much more structured than life. We find that it remains unclear whether Ezer wishes to grant the reader the power to fill up at will the blanks in the text, or whether he regards the text as the final arbiter of the reader's actualization. Is the gap between the perfect man and the perfect man's lack of judgment filled by a freely judging leader or by a reader who is guided by the text instructions? So Ezer's emphasis is ultimately phenomenological. The reader's experience of reading is at the center of literary process. By resolving contradictions between the various viewpoints which emerge from the text, or by filling the gap between the viewpoints in various ways, The reader takes the text into their consciousness and make it their own experience. So we can say that while texts do set the terms on which reader actualizes meaning, the reader's own stores of experiences will take some part in process. So in this way, the reader's existing consciousness will have to make certain internal adjustments in order to receive and process the alien viewpoints that the text presents. The situation produces the possibility that the reader's own worldview may be modified as a result of internalizing, negotiating, and realizing the partially indeterminate elements of the text. So, in this way, this act of reading, it gives a chance to the reader to formulate what is unformulated, and we see that in Wolfgang Iser's discussion of Tom Jones, how it is not only the consciousness of the reader that is going to affect the understanding of the text, but there are many value systems which are there in the text. They are also going to impact the reader's own experiences about those values. Wolfgang Iser also talks about two dimensions of the text. One is artistic dimension that is related to the author, and the other is aesthetic dimension that is related to the reader. And throughout, Iser's discussion, we find that how Iser is trying to show a free play of the two tendencies. So a text can be understood in context of these two terms or in between these two extremes. So with this, I come to the end of this lecture. Thank you for watching this.